Here we go. Here we go. So I lived on San Juan Island at sometime, and everybody was 5 minutes late. So we just called that island time, and that's appropriate, isn't it? If you can't hear me, Adele.
Not very well. Speak up just a little.
Speak up, my teacher voice?
Yes.
There we go. Here we are for another Writer's Read special event, a book launch with Anne Irish, the author. And here we go, of course, with you know what? Paul Niebeck's wonderful poem, I Say a Phrase, You Say a Phrase. Here we go. Write, write, write.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
My name is Nancy Cope, and this is Anne Irish, the author of the book. But she is the author of 3 books and is working on a 4th book. My goodness, it's so exciting. Her other books, and tell us just the titles of her other books, will you?
This is the first one. Joseph W. Burns of Tennessee, a political biography. Why did I write that? Because he was my grandmother's second cousin. And at the end of his career and life, he became Speaker of the United States House of Representatives.
Yay. Okay. This was your first,
Right. And this is Hokkaido. And the subtitle is A History of Ethnic Transition and Development on Japan's Northern Island. When I lived in Japan for a year, I kept hearing about Hokkaido. No, I wasn't there, but it was so interesting. I needed to know more about it. And so I thought when I got back home, I'd find the book that told me all about Hokkaido. And it didn't exist in English. So of course I had to write it.
Okay, and your next book is titled, It's Always Uphill from the Dock. The subtitle is important, The Story of the Puget Sound Islands. And we're going to start with, how did you get this wonderful title?
Well, it came from a friend of mine who has also published travel books. She's a co-author of 2 travel books about the Pacific Northwest. And I thought, when I heard that, I thought, that's it. Because how did I get all my information about these islands? I would take the ferry into Seattle and occasionally Tacoma and go to a library, Seattle Public, Tacoma Public, University of Washington, and use all their resources to find out information. And so at the end of the day, I'd go home and I'd get off the ferry and I'd walk down the dock, which is a fairly long dock. And then I had to walk up the hill. And if I was lucky, I got my car in the lower lot. And if I wasn't lucky, maybe I'd get it in the upper lot. Occasionally I didn't get it there and I'd have to go around another area and be even higher. So yes, it really was uphill from the dock.
Well, be ready to hear about how this book about the islands of Puget Sound is a very different book than any I have ever seen. And I always start, my habit is to always start with a dedication. So I'm reading the dedication now. To my sister, Mary Bunsen Mullen, with love and thanks. Where is Mary sitting?
Over here.
Where is Mary? Mary, yay. So that was a beautiful dedication. And then from there, this book is just fascinating because it's so much of the history. You're not going to find the number for a kayak rental or a bed and breakfast in here. You're going to hear about the history of these islands. So it's from that perspective that this is a book of one kind. I have never seen a book like that before. So Anne, you have divided this book into 3 sections, and listen to the 3 sections before she describes how she chose these words. The 3 sections are origins, development, the present, and the future. So those are the 3 sections. And so Anne, get us started with how origins is the first section. Will you describe that?
Sure. Origins gets you to the islands and tells you what you need to know about them and their early history. Chapter 1 is about everything you can imagine in your geography class, you know, from the geology, the glaciers, the rocks, everything. And then everything else that goes into geography, flora and fauna, the sea and the land, just all the aspects of the islands. So after you read about that, then you go to the second chapter, which is about the first people there. And these, of course, were the Coast Salish people, as far as we know. And so, because this book is about the islands, what I do is talk about how Coast Salish people used the islands. Some of them lived on islands. Others would come to an island maybe every year in the summer for a summer camp to get the foodstuffs that they always got at that particular place. And so I don't talk about Native Americans who didn't happen to use the islands. You don't hear anything, well, maybe you hear a bit about the Yakima, for example. I might have mentioned them fighting in the Puget Sound Indian War, which I mentioned very briefly, for example. But no, this is about how the islanders used the islands. Excuse me, I woke up with a cold this weekend, and I hope I can do this. Chapter 3 is the explorers, and basically there were 2. Captain Vancouver for the British came in 1791 and led several ships, and they had lots of little boats that they took to go through small channels, and went all over Puget Sound, and you'll read about it. And again, notice all I talk about is what he did involving the islands. Other parts of this trip I don't mention at all. And the second explorer was Charles Wilkes, an American, 49 years later. And again, he and his crew explored the islands and other places, but I talk about the islands. And let's see, that's chapter 3. And chapter 4, some of you may have heard, because when I did a writer's read shortly after I came to Horizon House, I talked about the Big War, and it's based on this chapter.
Oh, that's right. I remember that writer's read about the Pig War, because that's kind of on my island, isn't it?
Right, so you'll read about the Pig War if you don't remember it all. Okay? And so that's the origins.
That's the origins section of the book.
Right.
Okay, so then we go to development.
Why don't you read the names of the chapters in the
Oh,
development
that's
section?
a good idea. Here we go. The development section starts on page 63, and we have chapter 5, the forests, chapter 6, the settlers, chapter 7, Meeting of Cultures. Chapter 8 is Farming. Chapter 9 is Industries of Sea and Land. Do you want to speak on that chapter at all? Do you want to speak a bit about that chapter?
Well,
Industries on sea and land.
right, if you think about it, it makes sense that they would have industries based on the sea.
Yeah.
Shipbuilding, for example.
Yeah.
Fishing, lots of fishing.
Mm-hmm.
But then, in more recent years especially, lots of land-based industries that you could have anywhere. I'm trying not to talk too much.
Yeah, okay, we'll keep going. Here we go. Chapter 10 is Communities. Chapter 11 is Mosquito Fleet Days. Now, can you just say what the mosquito fleet was to remind us? Some of us know and some of us don't know.
Well, before we had motor vehicles, we had small boats that went all over the Sound. We had no cars or trucks that took them, of course. And there were so many of them that the story says that somebody said, just like a flock of mosquitoes. So it became the mosquito fleet.
Oh, okay.
And you'll find out that as I write, if I'm talking about ferries, I'm talking about the ones that take motor vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if it's foot passenger vessels, those would be like the mosquito fleet.
Those would be in the mosquito fleet. Chapter 12 is Rails and Roads. Chapter 13 is Leisure. Chapter 14 is Defense and War. Chapter 15 is Ferries, Blackball and War. Chapter 16 is Ferries, the Washington State Ferries Era. And chapter 17 is Bridges. Oh, do you want to mention the one that wasn't built now?
Well, I was going to read a section about it, but I don't know if
Yeah, I might
can't.
need to read it for you.
You might read it for me.
Yes, I could read it for you. Then, chapter 18 is in the third section. The third section is called The Present and the Future. And chapter 18 I started with. Island life. And Ann and I have had some discussions about how life is a little different on an island. How many, raise your hand if you have lived on an island. Let's see, look at this, look at this. Oh, I love it. Yeah. Barbara raised her hand, Barbara Ray. She's lived on an island. And then I'll talk about the end of the book. But I think you were going to read, I don't have those pages noted. Do you want me to read?
There's a very short section, so I'll try the first section.
You want to try
I was
it?
going to read, yeah. This is in the chapter about industries. And let's see, can you find Guaymas Island, which is just north of Anacortes?
North of Anacortes.
Right. And we'll see if this works out.
Dear Linda, while we were getting ready,
Right.
Linda said,
Anacortes is north.
Right.
she said, I'm an East Coast person. She was very clear about
Okay, so
that.
let me see.
Do you see it?
Hansville.
Not yet, not yet.
Keep going.
Keep going. Get help from the audience here.
Camino, Cookville, Oak Harbor.
Keep going.
Yeah,
All right, there you are, you got it.
I found Guaymas.
Good, Linda. Okay, there's Guaymas.
All right. In July 1966, Northwest Aluminum Company officials announced plans to build a plant on Guaymas Island. Aluminum production requires a lot of energy, and Washington State's hydroelectric power was relatively inexpensive. Boosters, including the state's two senators, Henry M. Jackson and Warren Magnuson, emphasized the 1,000 or more jobs the plant would bring and the economic boost it would mean for the Anacortes area. Skagit County promoters supported the plan. Aluminum company officials promised that nearby islands would be neither developed nor armed. Building such a factory would require rezoning up to 700 acres on Guaymas Island. Company officials announced that the plan would use only 140 acres of this land, while the rest would be planted and landscaped. Attendees at a Guaymas Island Community Club meeting voted 101-2, however, to fight any necessary rezoning. Opponents of plant construction organized the Save the San Juans Committee and hired a Seattle lawyer who described Guaymas as extremely pastoral, passive, quiet, recreational, and residential, and thus not the place for heavy industry. The Board of Skagit County Commissioners did rezone the Guaymas site for industry. Opponents filed suit. Legal wrangling ensued, and after months of turmoil, the Northwest Aluminum Company announced on February 25th, 1967, that it was dropping its plans to build on Guaymas Island. Bitterness resulted, some who favored the industry blaming weekend and summer folks for stopping industrial development on Guaymas while supporting it in their home communities. Meanwhile, the rezoning decision remained until the Washington State Supreme Court ruled it illegal in April 1969. But I want to add two points about this. First, that you've probably heard of the San Juan Preservation Trust. It's the first land trust ever made in Washington State, and it came in 1979, a few years after this. And it was the Guaymas Island struggle that had a lot to do with how the San Juan folks got together and did this. So it played an important part.
Yes, it did.
In land preservation in Western Washington. And the other thing is, I didn't give you the name of the Seattle lawyer who worked for the good guys, the land preservation guys. You've heard of him, and you might not remember it, but you really have heard of him. His name was John Ehrlichman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. If you don't remember, he was one of President Richard Nixon's top henchmen, and he ended up in prison for Nixon because of what he did in the Watergate scandal. And I didn't remember that, because I was working on this long after that had happened. And when I read about it, sitting in the library, probably at the U, wow, really? Anyway, so there you are.
There we are.
And I made it.
Okay. So, chapter, the present and the future. Have we talked at all about that section?
No, we haven't.
That would be obvious, the present and the future.
Right.
But generally speaking, what issues are you dealing with there?
Well, just what does the present and the future hold for us? When I was writing this, COVID had not yet done its thing. And the publisher had accepted the book, but it didn't come out for quite a while because of COVID. And I don't know how I would have worked it in, but I'd stopped right before COVID pretty much. But what are the issues now that didn't arise so much earlier? And one I can mention is water. Do the islands all have enough water? And that really is a question, because most of the islands have a sole source aquifer, meaning that all of their water comes from this one area. And if they pump it all up, they don't have any left. So people are very concerned about water use And if you look at the policies, some of the islands do show that you have to be careful about your water use.
Absolutely. So that is a concern, isn't it?
Right.
Absolutely. Now, I think your book, oh, I love it that we're both, is that my book or your book?
That's mine.
I, after skimming this book with wonderful pictures, said, oh, the end of the book is sometimes the best part of the book. She has done so much. The section on acknowledgments, she thanks everybody who helped her. And it goes, how many pages, dear heart? It's 4 pages long. And finally, oh, it's just, that's a good read, right there, the acknowledgments. Don't miss it when you're reading them. Then, notes. Now, Anne, I haven't written my book yet, and some of the rest of us haven't, but notes in this sense means what?
Okay, so is there anything that has to be said that shouldn't be in the basic text? And what I'm talking about is things like identifying the source of a quotation. And I do quote people in the book, and I didn't want to have it right there on the page. I didn't want a footnote because that breaks up the thinking. So I just put that sort of stuff at the back of the book. And occasionally, when something needs explaining, I thought I added that too.
Okay, so there are notes for every chapter.
Not very many. It's not like a book you would write for college professors to use in class, which have lots and lots and lots of notes.
But these are helpful notes
Right.
to
And
those
the
of us who
The
are not
other thing I can
professors.
say is that I do have one copy of the manuscript in which I added in pencil all the sources for every fact that I put in there. So if somebody wants to know something and asks me, I hope I can find it.
It's just a rich section. I'm just looking at this chapter on leisure. I said, now what notes did she have on leisure? And Bill Risto, you didn't know him at all? Bill Risto, William Risto.
No.
He lived on San Juan Island
All right.
before he moved to Bainbridge. And he wrote an article in the Seattle Times on August 30th, 1986. I mean, look at the research she's done. It's just incredible. But the last section is the longest section, no, next to the last section, and it's called suggested reading. And there's suggested reading on exploration, there's suggested reading on ferries, on Anderson Island, on Bainbridge Island, Day Island. Where's Day Island?
Who knows where Day Island is? Okay, it's on the edge of Tacoma.
Yeah.
There is somebody there. Okay, good. It's a little tiny island, but it's a real island. And you could drive onto it over a little bridge and then drive on its little roads because it doesn't have room for big roads. And it really is tiny. It's north of the golf course, you know, the fancy
The
golf
fancy
course.
golf, yes.
But it's on the shore there.
Oh,
If you
my.
take the train, you would see Day Island if you knew it was there.
Yeah.
If you didn't know it was there, you'll miss it.
If you weren't sleeping on the train.
Well, it's not very obvious.
Lopez Island, Lummi Island, Marrowstone Island, reading about McNeil Island, Orcas Island, San Juan Island, and then generally San Juan Islands, and Sinclair Island, and Stewart Island.
I'm not going to point all these out on the map.
No, I'm not asking you to.
Yeah.
Then I am amazed when an index is the most helpful part of a book. There are some books that don't have an index. This index starts on page 135 and ends on page 349.
I think it starts on a different page than you said.
Well, there's no number on this page, so I subtracted one. You know what I mean? This was 326 minus 1
It's 325.
is 320, but 325 does not appear on that
All right.
page. You're absolutely right. I love it. But tell us a bit about the index process. Did you do this, or did you get somebody to do the index, or?
Well, I had done the index on the first 2 books, and it is a long and tedious process. But I didn't know any better. And by now, they can do pretty good indexes on computers. But too many books that are published now, you look at the index, well, will be books that are not for college professors. And they just have, well, what's the subject? Bainbridge Island.
Yeah.
And then they'll have all the things under Bainbridge Island,
Yeah.
period. No, that's no good. It's not going to help you, because if you've got 30 entries, are you going to look at all 30 to try to find what you want? No. And so I told them when they did it, it had to have subtitles. And they wondered if I'd done any work, and I said, well, yes, I have, and I sent them a printout online of the basic subjects and subtitles that I'd suggested. And
Yeah.
I guess they worked from there. It looks like.
It looks like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just so detailed. And the punctuation of the index, I said, there is a skill, isn't there? Maybe this. Oh, what a treat this is going to be for people to read. Thank you so much. Now, you have some more reading to do. How are you feeling about reading another section for us?
This is a longer section.
Yes.
So, shall I try it, and then you can take over?
Yeah,
Why
why don't you? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think you're going to remember this section. Come on.
Which island is it about?
It's about the ferry system.
Okay.
Maybe this is your copy of the book.
I think it might be, dear heart, if I put up a marker for the dedication.
Right, because I don't see my markers. Oh, there's no, those are the other books.
No, but good to mention. Oh, here. Oh, thank you so much. I would have fallen and broken a leg. Oh, isn't that something? Here we are, Anne. Anne and I got together last Monday to discuss the format for this, and we had such a good time talking with each other. I said, let's just talk with each other. And this is what's happening. So this is very Horizon House and very on the spur of the moment here. Did you find it?
No, I have not found it.
It was on the,
Oh, it's in, I was looking under ferries, Washington State ferries. I should have looked under bridges, which is the chapter it's on.
see, we're so human, and that's good.
All right, here we go. And you'll understand what it's all about. The greatest bridge project of all has not yet been accomplished and may never be. This is bridging Puget Sound. As with the bridges that have been built and the plans that never came to fruition, the failure to bridge Puget Sound via one of the islands has played a decisive role in island history. After World War II, future-minded people in Western Washington dreamed of bridging the Sound. Including an island in the project made sense for 2 reasons. It would preclude the need for ferry service to that island, as well as across the Sound. Also, 2 shorter spans are more feasible than 1 longer one, both technically and economically, because the most useful route would be the one that best served the 2 population centers of Seattle and Bremerton. Bainbridge and Vashon were the 2 islands under consideration for this project. Charles E. Andrew, Washington Toll Bridge Authority's chief engineer, announced in 1951 that a floating bridge from Seattle to one of the islands would be feasible. A suspension bridge from Vashon Island to the Kitsap mainland would complete the route. Andrew predicted that if bridges were built from West Seattle via either Bainbridge or Vashon Island and on to the Kitsap County mainland, then in 25 years, a second bridge would have to be built farther north to cope with traffic. 3 routes received serious consideration. West Point in Fort Lawton, north of downtown Seattle to Bainbridge Island. Alki Point south of downtown Seattle to Bainbridge, and Brace Point just south of the current Fauntleroy ferry dock to the northern point of Vashon. The main bridge would be floating, like the 1940 floating bridge built across Lake Washington. Another suggested alternative was a tube submerged about 50 feet below the surface. During the early 1950s, the Washington State Legislature adopted several bills to facilitate this bridge project. Meanwhile, an Army engineering report did not oppose cross-sound bridging. With this a real possibility, the Bainbridge Review and Vashon's Islander News Record carried article after article and almost as many editorials explaining why their island was preferable. Other, more dispassionate voices spoke up, too. Commercial carriers did not want a floating bridge interfering with travel. Tacoma interests expressed concern, fearing both the loss of business and interference with marine traffic to the city. The Army Corps of Engineers needed to approve any bridge project, and some local seafarers backed a Vashon route because it would interfere less with naval traffic, leaving the passage to the Navy Yard at Bremerton unimpeded. After state officials formally chose the Vashon route in May 1955, Bainbridge folks worried about losing their direct ferry to Seattle. Planners considered providing a foot passenger boat between Eagle Harbor and Seattle, but to many people this seemed inadequate. A few Bainbridge and Vashon men held a contest to see which bridge route would be crossed faster by rowboat. The Bainbridge route had taken was 4/10 of a nautical mile shorter than the Vashon route, and Reverend Vincent Gowan of Port Blakely, in his cedar boat, the FOG, won by just under 13 minutes. Gowan's rowboat is now on display at the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum. It's up above as you go in the entrance, if they haven't moved it since I've been there, because I haven't been there since before COVID. By autumn 1955, the Cross Sound project was dead, at least temporarily. The recent cost. State Senator and later Governor Albert J. Rossellini charged that the state could have financed the bridge project, but our present state administration simply does not want to build it at this time. In 1957, State Highway Director William A. Buggy predicted that a cross-sound bridge system would carry traffic by 1964. Bridge talk continued, by 1960 centering on consolidation. For example, a bridge could be built from Bainbridge directly to Bremerton, with the Seattle-Bremerton ferry route closed and 24-hour passenger service provided between Seattle and Bainbridge. Various versions of consolidation engendered consideration for years, but few of the passengers involved liked any of them. Or how about helicopters instead of bridges for Bainbridge Island and other places? Journalist Polly Lane joked in 1960. By this time, some islanders were expressing the desire to maintain their isolation. The Bainbridge Review editorialized in 1961 that bridges could cause unwanted island population and development. Since then, whenever Puget Sound bridges are promoted, such concerns arise. Another cross-sound bridge proposal in 1965 supported bridges across the Sound via Vashon, plus another from the Port Orchard vicinity to Bainbridge Island. The State Highway Department recommended this combination as the most economical to build. Bainbridge interests opposed this because they would then have such a roundabout route to Seattle. Cost again doomed the project, and opposition to a bridge kept growing. More people, especially residents of Vashon and Bainbridge Islands, had indicated they would rather keep ferries. Throughout the late 1960s, bridge discussions continued but did not lead to action. More than once, Puget Sounders would hear that the bridge idea was dead, only for it to revive a few years later. In 1969, one more study looked at consolidation of Bremerton and Bainbridge runs. For a while, the issue remained dormant, but a state report in 1984 suggested different ideas. Consolidation of nearby ferry routes and, in addition, bridges between some of the San Juan Islands. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer editorialized that the spans would be economic millstones and environmental abominations. And that bridge suggestions were harmless enough. The danger is that people may begin to take them seriously. Once again, nothing happened. The idea of a cross-sound bridge never quite died. In 1992, a study by the state about the future of transportation across the Sound included the possibility of a bridge. And again, the best bridge alternative seemed to be a Vashon route. Plus feeder bridges in Kitsap County. I'm going to give it to you to sample opinion.
To sample opinion, consultants hired by the state traveled to the various communities that could be impacted by a bridge. Mainlanders living south of Seattle felt that approaches for a Vashon bridge would, quote, destroy neighborhoods and cause traffic jams in their area. Then at the South Kitsap County meeting, one area resident pointed out that Puget Sound is a friendly barrier which the bridge would break. The Vashon Island meeting came on an evening of March 9, 1992, and took place in the high school gymnasium, the largest venue on the island. People streamed in, even latecomers who had to park their cars far from the school, until about 1/5 of the island's population was in the building. Speakers went to the microphones and audience members held up signs while they clapped and booed, depending on the message. No islander defended the bridge proposal. The newspapers which described the scene, including the New York Times, mentioned the sign, "If you build it, they will come." One speaker asked audience members which of them opposed the bridges. As Timothy Egan wrote, the room thundered with applause, a 5-minute standing ovation. When asked who favored the bridges, no one responded. After this, the Bainbridge Island meeting the next night seemed tame. People there were just as adamant that there should be no bridge via Bainbridge Island. Throughout the Puget Sound region, county and city officials plus island residents opposed the bridge plans. The 1992 study did not lead to cross-sound bridges, and no serious attempt to design, finance, and build them has since arisen. The idea continues to surface, however, when considering ways to relieve congestion on the very busy Tacoma Narrows Bridge. One alternative under study was a cross-sound bridge via Vashon Island. In 1996, officials of the State Department of Transportation again came to Vashon and other communities. And just as in 1992, islanders expressed strong opposition to a bridge across their island. Project manager Tim Horgan said a majority of Gig Harbor residents think building a bridge across Vashon to Burien will resolve problems on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Vashon Island's response: "We want a Walmart in Gig Harbor." Don't get me started. The eventual decision adopted the regional preference, a second span across the Narrows, parallel to the existing one. This opened to traffic in 2007, and Cross-Sound Bridge have not, Nancy? This opened to traffic in 2007, and cross-sound bridges have not been built. Islanders must remember, though, that island opinions may have little weight should bridge construction ever become imminent, because the purpose of such bridges is to cross Puget Sound rather than to provide convenient access to an island. That's the end. Yeah, that's good. Oh, and what a good summary of that event.
Well, I remember it. Were you there? Yep. I was late because I had another meeting to go to before that, but it was like that. And I should show you, we haven't talked about the maps.
Yeah,
there
that
are
was
6
next.
maps at the front that show you where all these places are. And I tried very hard to include every community I mentioned in the text on a map somewhere.
Great.
I didn't make the maps. I hired a gal who's a cartographer to do it, and she did a wonderful job.
Great.
So I can't take
Speaking
credit
of
for it.
maps, would Mary and Linda get microphones? Because now I want all of you to name an island. You don't have to have lived on the island, but look at the map and just name one island. Let's see how many we can name in 5 minutes. How about that? I want to hear what you see and what you remember, and maybe a new island to you. So raise your hand if you can say the name of one of the islands in Puget Sound that has not been mentioned. Oh, now folks, here we go.
Yeah, Anderson Island.
Okay.
Orcas.
Do they need it? Can you yell, or do we need microphones? Help me on this.
Heard you say Orcas?
Orcas Island.
Orcas Island.
Cypress.
Hartstein Island.
Fox Island. Fox Island.
Oh, Fox Island.
And somebody said Hartstein.
Maury Island.
Say again.
Maury Island.
Oh, yes.
A-U.
Lake Island.
Lake Island. Excellent.
Lummi Island.
Yep,
Lummi Island.
Raft Island.
yep, that's in there too. It's awfully little, but it's in there.
Squaxin Island. Squaxin Island.
Yes,
Oh,
that's
where is
important.
that, Ann? Do you know where that
Yes,
is?
Squaxin
Can
Island
you
is
find it on the-
to the southwest.
Is it on the map
No,
as we
it's
speak?
way down in the southwest. It's an
You
Indian
messed up the map.
reservation.
You said it was in Poultry. Why is it in Poultry?
Well, because its history is so interesting. At least for this book, it's important because the state, of course, decided it would be wonderful for a reservation for Indians because it was an island, so there they'd be. Well, it's not a good location, right?
Yeah.
There was no good water source for interest. And so it's an interesting story what happened to the Squaxin Island.
Did we find it yet? Where is
So
What
it
am I
was
looking for?
farther down,
it? Farther down?
What is it?
Squaxin, and over to the west.
To the west.
Yeah.
Below. So I've got Fox and McNeil.
Okay, now go to your left.
Anderson.
Yeah, go to your left now.
Go to my left.
Yeah.
There's McNeil.
No, there's nothing over there.
Yes,
Oh, yes, there is.
there it is. It's the orange one, I believe.
Yes.
Because they gave it a different color because it's an Indian reservation. Am I correct?
Yeah. Oh, my.
Look at these waterways. We're so lucky. We live in such a wonderful place. Call out any more islands, are there?
Silver Spring.
Guaymas Island.
Guaymas,
Yep.
Brown.
Brown.
Yep.
Brown.
Yep. I'm not sure I mentioned Brown in the book. It's near Friday Harbor, right?
It's in the mouth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Beautiful.
Way up.
We have,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that's good. We've named quite a few.
How many islands are there?
40 million of them. It depends. It depends on whether the tide is in or out.
I have a question, and it's certainly a compliment, a fabulous book. Is there any possibility it could become one of the talking books published by the state of Washington for those of eyes limited? Or are the maps too impossible to turn it into a talking book?
Yeah, good question, Dorleen. I'm not sure how books are chosen for the talking book program in the Seattle Public Library. Do you know any?
I know nothing
Yeah,
about
know
that,
nothing
no.
about that. That would be worth pursuing.
We'll talk about it, okay?
Yes, yeah.
Sure, good idea, thank you.
Okay. We are now open to questions and answers. So Q&A is, does anybody have a question for us
Yes,
specific?
tell me please, I'll hook up. Tell me please about the sole source of water on each island.
Oh, well, where does the island's water come from? There's Vashon. All of the water consumed on Vashon Island comes from the rainfall that has fallen in previous years that does what it does. And that's our source of water. So we're limited to what's there.
And how about on Vashon? Is that the case?
Pardon me?
On Vashon?
Yeah.
There was a story I heard recently that on San Juan Island, there's a problem cropping up with contamination.
That's true in various islands, yes.
Okay.
Yes, right. And both contamination from stuff that shouldn't be there and from salt water.
Thank you so much.
And let's see, an interesting point on the water supply is that the naval base on northern Whidbey Island uses a lot of water. Where does it come from? The Skagit River. They buy it from Anacortes, which is also on an island, but Anacortes gets its water from the Skagit Island on the Go ahead.
Did you try to visit most of the islands that you wrote about? Did you actually go to them?
Yes, Mary went with me several times. She's a great traveling companion. And all the islands that are reached by a public ferry, I've been to. And I have not gone to the islands like Stewart that don't have public transportation. I just didn't have the time to do that. It would have been great, but I couldn't fit it.
Okay. Question?
No, I have a comment.
Comment. I love it. Here, Mary. Anne Marie.
I grew up on Staten Island in New York City. And when I was a child, the only way we could get to New York, which was Staten Island is one of 5 boroughs of New York City. So the only way that we could get to any of those other areas of New York was by the Staten Island ferry boat. Well, they built, right after Joel and I left Staten Island, got married and left, they decided to build a bridge, which we now know is the Verrazano Bridge, which goes from Brooklyn to Staten Island. Well, it has become a pathway from Brooklyn and from all of the 5 boroughs to get to New Jersey. And it has made such a difference in the, I say climate, not meaning climate, hot and warm, but the living conditions on the island that people actually now call folks that live there either pre-bridge or post-bridge. And it's quite the debate. So I'm glad that these folks are saying no to a bridge. It does have its destructive components.
That's right.
I have a question about the water issue. I had a question about the water issue. You mentioned the salt water. Is the concern that as the regular good drainage water it goes away, does that mean the salt water is able to move into the soil?
I'm not an expert on these technical details, so I don't know. But I do mention in the book several islands that have had trouble with salt water intrusion into people's water systems if they live near the coast. And I'm not sure why it happens when it happens, but yeah, that's a problem.
Come right ahead.
And for 66 years on Vashon, what was the most remarkable change you saw on the island?
The most remarkable change, oh gosh. That's hard to say because I did my thing, whatever it was. For a number of those years I was teaching in this high school there, and I lived my life the way I always lived my life, pretty much. And we traveled off the island the same way we had traveled off the island before, on the ferries. You know, I don't know. If I go back now, I see some of the fancy big houses and so forth. But that had nothing to do with me.
What year did you actually move on to that house?
1955, would you believe? So it's been a while, yeah.
And you moved off in what year?
2 years ago.
2 years ago,
Yeah.
55
Go right
to 2
ahead.
years ago.
I have a question, a statement, about Guaymas Island. In about the 1990s, the Guaymas Island water system, which was underground water, was in jeopardy from saltwater intrusion. And so what happened is the Skagit Valley Water Commission came to Guaymas and asked if they would like to have a desalinization plant. And so we do, and it's been that way now for what, 30 years. And so they bring in the salt water and it goes through filters that are so microscopic that it actually takes out the bacteria and the salt.
Yeah. And that is true of some other small islands in the St. Juans.
Yeah.
But it's expensive.
Yes.
Any more comments or? Here's one. Here we go, over here.
With climate change, what are the predictions, or do you know about the effect of rising seawaters on the islands? Perhaps some of the water issues and intrusion is a factor, but just in terms of loss of land.
Well, it will be a problem anywhere where you're on the coast. You know what can happen. if the sea level rises, you
Yes.
lose your property, and islands all have coastlines.
I'm just wondering if if you've seen any studies about, predictions of the effects on certain
Yeah.
islands.
I have not specifically, but you read little items in the paper about this could happen and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's a worry.
That's a worry. Ooh, there's many worries. Okay. I'm going to end the evening with the first chapter, the first paragraph in the preface. The islands of Puget Sound have long fascinated visitors. In 1948, a real estate company held a contest for the best 100-word essay on why you should live in the San Juans. The prize was 3.5-acre Dead Man Island, about 150 yards off the southwest shore of Lopez Island. The winner, Mrs. Richard Annabelle, had long fancied having an island of her own. Unfortunately, she was too busy raising 3 children to use her prize. She soon found a buyer, Mrs. A.E. Chamberlain, also of Seattle, who traded a 1936 model car for the island she had never seen. And she explained, "We took a trip through the islands recently, and I just decided I'd like to own one." Thank you, Anne Irish. This has been wonderful.